Chapter 3 of Stories of the Ships by Louis Ransome Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 3, Getting Together, What the British Bluejacket Thinks of the American. The British naval officer, sapient of many ports and peoples, had a pretty clear idea that in the American naval officer he was going to find an ally who, in spite of a number of superficial differences from himself, would still be a deal easier to act in intimate cooperation with than any of those with whom he had been fighting up to the time of the entry of the United States into the war. With the British sailor it was different. Only a few of him had ever met any American bluejackets, and these meetings, for the most part confined to the bars and bunts of Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the other ports of the Far East, had not always been of a nature calculated to be promotive of international amity. The American Jackie was chiefly remembered by the British for the softness of a speech that belied the hardness of a fist, and an astonishing and unaccountable penchant for scattering Mexican dollars from rickshaws for coolies to scramble for. It was a good deal as a brine-pickled old British man-of-warsman of many years' service said to me a few days ago. "We never had no chance to know the Yanks afore the present, sir. We was allus eyeing each other distrustful like when we was in the same ports, and we was never getting much closer than the length of a bar apart. Result was that we only seed the few things in them that was different from what we was, and they likewise wid us. And, of course, we never spotted the things in which we was just alike. All that I recollect of the Yanks we used to run into on the China station was that they was dressed different from us, talked different, and even swore different. The way they cussed struck me most of all. It was so earnest-like. That was the thing I remembered 'em best for, the blokes what cussed like they was sayin' their prayers." And so it was that the British and American bluejackets remembered each other for their differences rather than for the traits they had in common. Naturally, the picture was a distorted one on both sides. But when, with the coming of the American ships to European waters, the first chance to get together and become really acquainted was offered, each soon began to see the other in the proper perspective, and from the very first they have become better and better friends with every day that went by. A good many British sailors have told me during the last few months of the increasing ties of friendship and kinship that were knitting between them and the Yanks, but perhaps some extracts from an article which has just appeared in the little monthly magazine published by the lower deck of one of the battleships of the Grand Fleet will give the best idea of the way things have gone in this respect. It was signed Bluejacket, and I have learned that the writer is a seaman gunner who, like the great majority of his mates, never met any of his cousins from across the Atlantic until the American battleship squadron joined the Grand Fleet last winter. "We had all heard a good deal of the Yankee fleet," it begins, "and a few of us had seen Yankee ships before in our voyages abroad, but to the most of us their manners and customs were a sealed book. And so many curious glances were cast toward their battleships after their arrival to take their place beside us, just to catch a glimpse of an American sailor. We all had our various ideas of what they were really like, and I'm giving away no secret when I say that we did not expect them to come up to our standard, or to be very much of our own kind. This was inevitable, owing to the feeling fostered by some sections of the British press during the preceding years of the war, in which America had been neutral. Consequently, we were more than a little surprised on meeting them ashore for the first time to find them such very good fellows. Perhaps the thing that surprised us most about them was to find that there was less difference between the English that they talked than there was between that of the Cockney and the Scotchman, or the Cornishman and the Yorkshireman, or the Welshman and the Lancashireman. That is to say, it was easier for the run of us to understand them than it was for us to understand each other. But the thing that we liked best about them was the quiet way they had of speaking. This, I must admit again, was also a great surprise to us, for the Yankee of our funny papers and music halls was invariably very loud-mouthed and boastful. They had some rather fearful and wonderful slang, it is true, but the most of it was so expressive that we had not the least difficulty, first in following it, and then beginning to adopt it for our own use. For instance, it was as easy to see that some classed those shooting irons on the Lizzie referred to the 15-inch guns of the Queen Elizabeth, as it was to see that "pretty nifty with his hot footing, eh, boy?" referred to the way Charlie Chaplin was kicking out with his feet in the movie. There I have dropped into a Yankeeism myself. Nothing could be more catching. At the YMCA hut. We have probably been borrowing more of their language than they have of ours so far, for many of the Yankeeisms seem to go right to the spot so much better than ordinary English. Our first meeting on shore got on so well that we decided to get up some kind of a game with them. It was out of the question for us to try to play their baseball or football, just as it was for them to tackle our cricket. But we had heard that one of their ships had been having a try at our association football, and on the strength of this we sent them a challenge for a game of soccer. The fact that they jumped at the chance to take us on at a game at which they had practically no experience is the best evidence of the kind of sporting spirit we have found the Yanks showing about everything. When the time for the game came, there is no denying that we began to get rather nervous, not because we were not sure we were going to give them a licking, for ours is the champion soccer team of the Grand Fleet, but because we weren't quite sure what we were going up against. There goes another Yankeeism, just because it puts the thing better than any words in our own language. We had read of what a shambles the field at an American football game was, and of how the men fought in armor, like the knights of the Crusades, and of how each team was attended by its own stretcher-bearers and casualty-clearing station. Frankly, we were afraid that they might take the occasion to Yankify soccer along these lines. As a precautionary measure, we made a point of getting shore leaves for just as many men as possible, so as to be sure of being in sufficient force to back up our boys if it came to a fight for life. Indeed, we were much relieved to find on landing that the British Bluejackets outnumbered the American by 3 to 1, and that there were no evidences of hospital arrangements. Of course we beat them, for our team had years' experience of the game, where theirs had days. But the game was keenly contested all the way, and the score of 6 to 1 in our favor was by no means as one-sided as we could have piled up against many of the British ships of the Grand Fleet. There was no sentiment about it either. We licked them as bad as we could. Their training in the Yankee game had made them quick to master the main points of the British, and the result was that they had made a progress in the latter which must have been just about a record, considering only 1 or 2 of them had ever seen soccer before. We heard them cursing each other a bit now and then in an effort to stiffen up their defense, but so far as we were concerned they displayed nothing but the cleanest kind of sportsmanship. By their showing on this occasion, we were prepared to hear, as we did shortly, that this same Yankee team had won games of soccer from 2 or 3 of the British battleships and battle cruisers. Nothing but their greater interest in baseball, which they were able to take up in the spring, has prevented the Yanks from turning out a football team that would have been a real contender for the Grand Fleet Championship, and even as it is, they have given us an example of their adaptability, quick-wittedness, and sportsmanship that has won the admiration and respect of everybody. But it was not till the long days of summer came and shore leave was granted more liberally that we had a chance to really form friendships with our new allies. Perhaps it was baseball that helped us more than anything else in getting acquainted. The Commander-in-Chief having provided suitable grounds, a baseball league was formed of the teams of the several American battleships, and from the very start these games provided a very strong counter-attraction to our own football matches. There might be a half-dozen football games in progress, but the moment the wild yelling from down in front of the pavilion told that a baseball game was under way, All the spectators melted away at once, and sometimes even the players themselves chucked their hands in and went over to see the antics of the Yanks. It was these antics, rooting I think they call it, though I don't quite know why, that attracted us at first, but we were not long in finding out what they were driving at, and really following the progress of the game. Certainly none of us had ever seen the ball handled with such dexterity, both in the way it was caught and the way it was thrown, and the best cricket seemed dull and tame in comparison. We especially admired the quickness of the players on their feet, both in fielding and running round the bases. Few British bluejackets could show such speed, and we have decided the Yankees are faster because they are all shorter service men than we are, and so have had less time to get slow and beefy through ship life. We hope to make our beef and bulk tell against them in boxing and rowing. They tell us that it takes 10 years to make a good baseball player, and we can well believe it. As none of us are yet ready to acknowledge the possibility of the war lasting that long, it is hardly likely that we shall try to turn out any teams with the idea of nosing the Yanks out of the baseball championship of the Grand Fleet. But all the same, we are fully determined to tackle the game for the game's sake, and to play it among ourselves as we get a chance. The British Matlock never did have the patience to play cricket, but baseball has so much that cricket lacks that it is by no means impossible that he may take to it in time, just as our Canadian cousins have. In the meantime, our old song, which goes, "We'll ramp and we'll roar like true British sailors," will have to be sung, "We'll ramp and we'll roar like Yankee baseballers," for there is no question that they can out-ramp and out-roar us with several cables' lengths to spare. The baseball games have given us a welcome chance to show our friendship for the American bluejackets. It is the custom to provide each member of a British shore leave party with tickets good for 2 pints of beer at the Recreation Club. The Yank ships, being teetotalers, did not do this, and so the poor chaps would have had to get on without any beer if we had not come to their rescue. Soon it became quite the regular thing for a British sailor to provide his Yankee chum with half his beer tickets, and as many of the days were sweltering hot, you may believe they were appreciated. As the present beer we get does not contain enough alcohol to intoxicate a fly, American mothers need have no fear that there is anything in this action calculated to lead their sailor boys astray. I need hardly say that the Yanks have reciprocated every time they had a chance. I was having tea at the Naval Club a few days, and having neglected to bring any sugar ashore from the ship, I was about to do the best I could without it, when an American sailor reached over from the next table and handed me his ration, saying he had come provided with an extra one for just that purpose. And it was fine white sugar, too. I have seen the same thing happen a number of times. The Yanks seem to be allowed an extra lot of sugar and sweets to make up for not having grog. They tell me that they don't miss the latter very badly, and I can't say that they seem any the worse for not having it. Perhaps that is the one thing that we have worried most about since the Yankees came, as to whether or not their example would cause the British ships to go dry, too. Who can say? Stranger things have happened, but the change will hardly come during the war anyhow. The few weeks' sport at this base gave the men a chance to meet in such a way that they could form real friendships, and I know of a number of instances where British sailors have asked Yankees to visit them in their homes if ever there is a chance that the leaves work out favorable to that arrangement. We found that we had a great many things in common with them, so much so that, writing some weeks after these meetings, it seemed awkward to speak of them as Yanks at all. They have become so much part and parcel of ourselves. I cannot close this without mentioning an amusing incident which occurred to a messmate of mine. This chap was told off for patrol duty at the railway station, and, as was usual, had a Yankee sailor as a partner, the latter being provided with a small truncheon, according to their custom. The British lad, who was a good deal of a youngster, got interested in the stick and asked many questions, to all of which the American replied with the greatest good humor. Among other things, he said that the truncheon was loaded, and that it was used for quieting obstreperous sailors. After this my friend kept his distance, and, on returning to his mess, explained to an attentive crowd all the happenings of the afternoon, ending up by saying that he took no chance with that loaded gun-stick, as he was afraid it might go off by mistake. It appears that he actually thought that a loaded stick meant one that went off when a man was hit with it. You may be sure that we lost no time in passing the joke on to the Yanks, who appear to be enjoying it quite as much as we have. Indeed, perhaps the surest sign of the good solid base our friendship is built on is the fact that it has long ago reached the joking stage, the one at which we both feel quite free to throw aside company manners and rag each other without fear of being misunderstood or hurting anyone's feelings. And that, let me tell you, means that we've at last got out a sheet anchor that ought to keep the bark of our common friendship head to wind through any storm that is ever likely to threaten to swamp it. I do not think there is much that I need add to this naive but comprehensive statement of the way in which the Yankee bluejacket has impressed his fellow of the British Navy. The life of the Grand Fleet is a strenuous one, and at times many weeks may go by in which there is no opportunity for the men to foregather ashore. How well these rare opportunities have been used by the British and American sailors to become acquainted is evidenced by the frequency with which the officers doing the ship's censoring come across letters from one to the other, and the cordiality of the feeling which is springing up may be judged by the fact that the commonest form of address is "Dear Chum." The friendships which are growing between the thousands of Americans and Britons who are holding the seas today will be of incalculable influence in strengthening the bonds of international amity between the two nations, upon whom most of the responsibility will rest in determining the future of civilization. End of section 3. Chapter 3 of Stories of the Ships by Louis Ransome Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 4, Getting Together, What the American Bluejacket Thinks of Britain and the British. The scroll of human experience has been unrolling at rather a dizzy rate for both the American soldier and sailor during the last year, but it has seemed to me to be the latter, probably because he has somewhat more time to sit and think than the former, that has gone the farthest in the orderly pigeonholing of his impressions. All the spirit of the soldier's being has been concentrated on his preparation for licking the Boche. In mind and body he is fitting himself for his grim task, and his outlook on life and things generally is not uncolored by the red mist that is deepening before his eyes as the time of his big moment approaches. With the sailor it is different. Although first and last the part that he is playing and will play in winning through is every bit as important as that of the soldier, his hate of the Hun is rather more impersonal, and he is less inclined to have his moments of seeing red than is the Yankee soldier. It is this fact that has made the American sailor a rather more detached and unbiased observer of the things the war drama has unrolled before him than is the soldier. "How do things look to you after a year of real war?" I asked a tall youth in blue jeans and a gray armless sweater whom I found tinkering with the sights of the forecastle gun of the destroyer in which I chanced to be out with for a few days at the time. The question was merely an ingratiating attempt to get acquainted on my part, and was ventured with no expectation of drawing a serious answer. I was not as familiar then as I have become since with the material they are making the young Yankee sailor of, however. He turned on me a keen eye with wrinkles at the corners, which I was quite right in surmising had come there through gazing at heat waves dancing along broad horizons long before he had squinted down the sight of a naval gun. My diagnosis of Texas cowboy only missed the truth by the difference between that and an Oklahoma oil driller with a varsity education and a ranch of his own. He leaned back easily with an arm over the gun breech, where a British bluejacket under similar circumstances would have stiffened at once to attention. And yet there was nothing familiar or disrespectful in his attitude. "It looks to me like 2 or 3 things," he said, after a moment of wrinkling his tanned brow as he collected his thoughts. "It looks to me as though these waters hereabouts were not going to be exactly a happy hunting ground for the U-boat, now that we're beginning to savvy the game good and proper. That's one thing. Another is that it's beginning to look as if they're waking up to the fact in the States that to call a man a politician is 1 degree worse than to call him a blank. It took them a year or 2 of war to learn that in England, and we didn't profit much by their example. Another thing, it looks like Americans, or at least those of us who have come across to this side, are going to have a fair chance to discover that the natives of these little islands are more or less the same kind of animals the Yanks are, after all. We've never had that chance in the last 140 years. Instead, we've been taught from our cradles to nurse a grudge that was really wiped out when we licked them, or such forces as they could send across then, and set up business on our own in '76. And one more thing, it looks as if Americans were at last getting off their blinkers in the matter of the Irish, that they are beginning to understand that but excuse me, sir." He turned and started adjusting the sighting mechanism again. "I just saw the captain come up on the bridge, and I don't like to swear too freely in his hearing, and a man can't talk about this end of Ireland, or leastways about the way it's acted in the war, without swearing." These offhand observations come pretty near to epitomizing the several salient ideas that have been crystallizing in the mind of the American sailor in the course of his year or more of active service in the war. If he isn't a destroyer or submarine operating against the U-boat, he knows full well what has been done in turning the little neck of the Atlantic where he works into what may well be termed a marine hell for the pirates. If he is in one or the other of these branches of the service, too, the fact that he has based in a south of Ireland port has given him a liberal education in the affairs of that distressful country, and stirred in him the deepest abomination of Sinn Fein, all it stands for and all who stand for it. A growing impatience and distrust of all professional politicians is common to the officers and men of all the American ships on this side, and bodes as hopefully for the future as does a similar feeling that is becoming increasingly evident in both the British Army and Navy. But most profound of all the emotions stirred in the breast of the American sailor by the war, and the new knowledge the war has brought him, is undoubtedly his awakening sympathy and admiration for the British and Great Britain. The picture the most of him brought over of the Briton was a sort of hazy composite built up of what his school histories told him about George III's soldiers, and of what he himself had seen of the Briton, as represented on the American stage and in the funny papers. If he was a man of 2 or 3 enlistments, and these, because of the great dilution of new men which has become imperative with the expansion of the Navy, are not encountered very often, the effect of the composite was heightened by a picture of the British bluejacket as the American had met him on the waterfront of this or that foreign port. It goes without saying that the incarnation of that kind of a composite didn't seem a very promising individual for the Yankee sailor to make friends with. This creature of fancy was a male, of course. What the female of the species was, he had an even hazier idea, and that there was really nothing to speak of to differentiate her from the girl, sister, or mother he had left behind him, he never dreamed. Considering that this is the way things looked to him at the outset, and the picture is not in the least exaggerated, one cannot but feel that the American sailor has made most gratifying progress in correcting his perspective in a comparatively limited time and with few opportunities. The men of the American battleships of the Grand Fleet, always on guard at its isolated base and able to grant scant and infrequent leave to anyone serving in it, have had less chance to see the country and its people than have their mates of the destroyers and submarines, whose bases have been more convenient to England, and with chances of leave turning up rather oftener. Their main, almost their only, point of contact, therefore, has been the British bluejacket. Everything considered, perhaps there could not have been a better one. No finer, and yet more fairly characteristic, cross-section of the British people could be revealed than that shown by the personnel of the Royal Navy, from stoker or seaman to commander-in-chief. There is no class by which the Briton himself should be prouder to be judged. I have already written of the mixed feelings of curiosity and interest with which the British bluejackets awaited their first intimate meeting with the Yanks. It was no whit different on the part of the latter. With the northern base swept by its more or less unending succession of winter storms, there was not much chance for personal contact in the first few months after the Americans came over, and before better weather and lengthening spring days gave opportunity for inter-fleet visits and foregatherings ashore, the men of both navies had had a good many chances to see each other handling their ships. From that alone a deep mutual respect was born, and it was on that solid foundation that the present astonishingly friendly relations between the men of the two allied navies is based. The British, with 4 years of war experience behind them, were doing things with their ships quite in the ordinary course of the day's work that the Americans had never reckoned on attempting, save in emergency. The shooting and the general efficiency of the British ships under the arduous North Sea winter conditions deepened and broadened the respect and admiration of the Americans the more they saw of it, and the more they discovered the extent to which they would have to exert and outdo themselves to equal it. The feeling of the American bluejacket on this score was concisely but comprehensively expressed by an old Yankee man-of-warsman, one of the few real veterans I have encountered on this side, with whom I had a yarn not long after the arrival of U.S.S. New York. Coming in from a big gun shoot, the American squadron had sighted a squadron of British battle cruisers carrying out a series of intricate maneuvers with destroyers at a speed which would have been reckoned as suicidal as late as a year or two ago, and which there is little doubt would not be attempted outside of the Grand Fleet even today. The sun-pickled phiz of the old sea-dog crinkled with a grin of sheer delight and wonder as the lean cruisers, each a mass of turrets, funnels, and tripod masts, between crossing bow wave and foaming wake, dashed in and out of the spreading smoke screens with a unity of movement that might have been animated by the pull of a single string. Then, when to cap the climax the speeding warship opened up with their heavies and began to straddle a target that was teetering along on the edge of the skyline 10 or 12 miles away, he gave his broad thigh a resounding slap and turned to me with, "By cripes, things do move, believe me! I was on the Oregon when we chased old Cervera's ships up the Cuba coast in the Spanish War, and we were nigh to busting our boilers doing half the speed of them battle cruisers. And as for keeping station, it was just a case of devil take the hindmost. But these Johnnies here would go straight through a scrap just as they're playing that little game over there. By cracky, I takes off my hat to them. They're sure on the job, and you just bet that's good enough for us." I think if I was asked to sum up very briefly just what the American bluejacket thinks of the ships of the Grand Fleet and the men who man them, I would simply quote those final words: "They're sure on the job, and you just bet that's good enough for us." With this foundation of respect and admiration to stand on once established, there was little to worry about on the score of personal relations. Both of them were as bashful as children on the occasions of their first tentative inter-ship visits, but this quickly wore off when they found that they both spoke the same language, and it was not very far from that to the palling stage. Then they began to box and play occasional games of soccer together, and when either could not play the other's sport, to give attention to baseball or rugger, as the case might be, with the idea of trying to find out for themselves what there really was in the other man's game. This is still going on, and British sailors with baseball bats and gloves, or Yankee tars with cricket bats and shin pads, are becoming commoner and commoner sights at the recreation grounds in the vicinity of the northern bases. I have already told how the feeling of the British bluejacket for the Yankee gob, as the latter appears to like to be called, changed from one of aloof curiosity through a mild sort of liking to active affection. And to describe how the American's feelings have run the same gamut would be merely to tell the story in reverse. But I cannot refrain from setting down the personal tribute of one gob in particular to British bluejackets in general, for in its way it is quite as typical as the words I have quoted respecting the old Yankee gunner's estimate of the Grand Fleet. The gob in question had been born on or very near the Bowery, but 7 years in the Navy had obliterated all traces but the accent. He was a stoker, and as the champion light-heavy of the American squadron was being put on in an occasional special bout in the course of the British squadron eliminations. In spite of the fact that the British box only 3 rounds, where the American Navy had been boxing 6, and a number of other variations in rules, he had done extremely well, having lost but a single bout, and that by being slightly outpointed. He was still nursing a black eye from this latter contest, in which his sportsmanlike conduct, no less than his cleverness, had won the admiration of every one present, when I asked him if he had been satisfied with the decision. "Perfectly," was the instant reply. "Had too much steam for me from the first gong. But I'll do better when I've worked out a little longer to go the 3 'stead of the 6-round course. What do I think of the British as sports? Say, they's the best ever. They's more than just gentlemen. They's regular fellows. Take it from me. And what more can you ask than that?" If the Yankee sailor has any superlative beyond regular feller to apply to a mate who has met with his approval, I have yet to learn what it is. The men of the American destroyers and submarines, working more by themselves than the battleships with the Grand Fleet, have seen rather less of the British bluejacket, and, with better opportunities for London leave, more of the British civilian than their mates in the latter units. They have all found much to entertain and interest them in Liverpool, London, Glasgow, and the other large cities they have visited. They have enjoyed the theatres and art galleries, and are very appreciative of the various canteens that have been provided for their comfort. But it has been none of these that has made the greatest appeal to them, but rather those at first rare, but now increasingly frequent, visits to an English or a Scottish home. I don't mean the boat on the river with band and the tea party on the lawn of some ancestral castle kind of thing, which are all very well as far as they go, but rather the quiet, unostentatious hospitality of a British home of somewhere near the same class as the visitor comes from in the States. This kind of kindness has gone straight to the heart. The Yankee sailor lad is a good deal more of a mother's boy than he will ever admit to any one save possibly some other boy's mother, and I have heard 2 or 3 pretty swaggery young gobs speak with rather more than a suggestion of a catch in their voices of the kindness that has been shown them, of the things they have seen and heard and learned in one of these visits to a British home. One day a quartermaster his folding bed was triced up next to mine in the forward torpedo flat, and we had fallen into the habit of exchanging confidences in the long quiet hours of submergence of the American submarine in which I was recently out on its regular North Atlantic patrol, told me how much the visit he had been privileged to make to a little English home in Liverpool had meant to him. And presently, after a pause, as though the thought of one had awakened the thought of the other in his mind, he told me of something else he had seen on one of his leave trips. "I happened to be in Cork for a few hours on my way through," he said. "We are not allowed to visit there, you know, for fear that we may be tempted to beat up a few Sinn Feiners. But if we are marooned there, waiting for a connection, there is nothing against our strolling about the town. Well, just at one end of the main bridge across the River Lee, they have the Stars and Stripes and the Union Jack floating side by side from the top of one of the iron poles of the electric car line. I don't know whose idea it was, except that the Sinn Feiners had nothing to do with it. Now, the ordinary way to have handled them would have been to bend each flag to separate halyards, and to hoist and lower independently. But some man with a head on his shoulders, possibly he had been a sailor, evidently had the run of the show, and what had been done was this. Taking 2 cross pieces, he had bent the flags to the 2 lines joining their ends. Then a single halyard, rigged to run over a block to the upper cross piece, hoisted and lowered the 2 flags, always side by side, at one operation. Well now, looking at that, it chanced that I seemed to see something more than a very neat little contrivance for saving time in handling a couple of squares of colored bunting. It seemed to me that it stood for a sort of symbol of the fact that the Stars and Stripes and the Union Jack are being rigged to fly together for a good many years, and that they aren't going to be able to lower one without bringing down the other. I do not know how many of the men of the American ships at the Irish bases have seen that particular little bunting hoist, but I do know that the sentiment my young submarine friend read into it finds an echo in the breast of practically every one of them. End of Section 4. End of Stories of the Ships by Louis Ransome Freeman.